If you are a Canadian retiree, there are 3 government benefits that could make up an important part of your retirement income. And that's what today's video is about. If you are Canadian and you are thinking of retiring somewhere outside of Canada, you're not alone. You want to perhaps retire somewhere warmer, maybe to Mexico or Portugal or Costa Rica, or maybe somewhere in Asia. Or you're just thinking about spending a few months somewhere. You're not alone in that. But there are a few things to consider before you leave Canada. And I'm not talking about what you are going to pack, which is important, but some other necessary things. And I'm not even talking about the cost of living or health insurance or other necessary facts, and there'll be more videos on that. These benefits don't follow the same rules. One generally follows you outside of Canada, but you have to meet a residency requirement. One generally does not continue indefinitely when you live outside Canada. And depending on your situation, losing one of these benefits could make a very big difference in your retirement budget. So let's talk about them. And I'll keep this simple. No complicated pension language, just the basics that I think every Canadian considering retirement abroad should understand. But I'm also not an expert in this. I'm just sharing with you what I know. And you may need to verify for yourself through the government websites. And as you'll see in this picture, retirement income as a 3-legged stool: CPP, OAS, and GIS. I want to make something clear that not everyone receives all 3. CPP depends on your contributions from your workplace. OAS depends largely on age and residency. And GIS is designed for lower income seniors who qualify for OAS. So these 3 aren't exactly 3 identical benefits, but for someone who qualifies for all 3, they can form a very important base underneath retirement income. And that's why I think of them as the floor underneath everything else. Your investments may go up and down. Your house may go up or down in value. Your part-time side hustle incomes may also change in values or disappear, and expenses may change. But government benefits can provide a relatively predictable foundation. And when you are planning to retire abroad, you may want to know exactly what happens to that foundation, because the rules are different for each one. Let's start with the easiest one, CPP, Canadian Pension Plan. And as you'll see in this picture, the CPP plan is explained very easily. And if you have worked in Canada and contributed to CPP throughout your working life, this is the benefit you have been paying into. And you can think of it as something you earned through your contributions. And generally, CPP is the simplest of these three when it comes to living abroad. You don't lose your CPP pension simply because you move to another country. Canada has arrangements that allow CPP payments to be made to people living outside Canada. And Service Canada provides information specifically for people receiving CPP while they are abroad. So imagine you have worked in Canada for 30 or 40 years and you have made your CPP contributions, and then you retire and you decide, I'm moving somewhere warm. Your CPP simply doesn't disappear because you cross the border. And that's the important point. CPP generally follows you. But there is another practical point. You still need to tell Service Canada about changes in your address and banking information. And your tax situation can also change when you are a non-resident. So CPP follows you doesn't mean there are no administrative or tax considerations. It simply means that moving abroad doesn't normally make you lose your CPP pension. And that's why CPP is different from the other two. Think of CPP as something you have earned. And the CPP that you earned, it goes where you go. I really like this picture because it makes the concept simple. You have the paycheck, you have the CPP deduction, and when you see those contributions building throughout your career, and finally you have the map showing the money potentially following you around the world. That's really the idea. You worked, you contributed, and that contribution created a pension benefit. So if you are sitting there thinking, if I move abroad, am I going to lose my CPP? Generally, no. But don't stop your research there, because the next benefit is where things get more interesting. The OAS, residency rule. OAS stands for Old Age Security. And unlike CPP, OAS isn't based on how much you contributed throughout your paycheck. You can actually qualify for OAS even if you never worked. Instead, residency is a major part of the eligibility rules, and this is where things can get a little confusing, especially if you are someone who moved to Canada later in life. Let's say you came to Canada at age 50, you live here until you are 66, that's 16 years, and now you decide to retire abroad. You might assume, well, I've been receiving OAS, so I'll just keep getting it wherever I live. Not necessarily. If you are living outside Canada, the general rule is that you need at least 20 years of residence in Canada after age 18 to continue receiving OAS outside Canada. There are exceptions and international social security agreements that can affect this. So this isn't something you should decide based on simple rule of thumb. But the 20-year rule is the important number to know. So keep that in mind. And so the rules matter in this case. The residency rules matter. This graphic is really useful here. It shows that timeline beginning at age 18, and then you see 20 years, and then 30 years, and finally leaving Canada. The important thing to understand is that OAS isn't simply about how many years you have worked. It's about residency in Canada. For a full OAS pension, the general calculation is based on up to 40 years of Canadian residence after age 18. So if you have lived in Canada for 30 years after age 18, you may have a pension of roughly 30 out of 40 of the full amount, and that's 75%. It doesn't mean that 30 years automatically gives you full OAS pension. 40 years is the benchmark for a full pension. And if you are living outside Canada, the separate question is whether you have enough residence to continue receiving OAS outside Canada. That's where the 20-year rule becomes important. So this is something you want to calculate before you move, not after. A simple example, let's make this real. Imagine someone came to Canada at age 45. They lived here for 20 years. At 65, they retire and they decide to move abroad. They may have enough Canadian residence to continue receiving OAS when they are outside Canada, assuming the other eligibility requirements are met. Now imagine someone else came to Canada at 50 and they live here for 15 years and they retire at 65 and move abroad. That's a very different situation. They are below the general 20-year threshold for receiving OAS outside of Canada. And that's why immigration history can become extremely important when you are planning retirement. Two people can both be Canadian citizens, both can be 65, both can have similar investment portfolios, both can be moving to the same country, and yet their government benefits could be very different because of their residency history. Next, we'll talk about GIS. And that's the third one. The Guaranteed Income Supplement. And this one can be especially important for lower income retirees. GIS is designed for people who receive OAS and have relatively low income. The amount depends on your income and family situation. And unlike CPP, GIS is not something you earned through your employment or contributions. It's a benefit tied to income and eligibility. And here is the important part for someone thinking about retiring abroad. GIS is generally not payable indefinitely while you are living outside Canada. If you leave Canada for more than 6 months, GIS generally stops, regardless of how long you have previously lived in Canada. That makes GIS very different from CPP and potentially very important to your decision about moving abroad. Now, if we look back at the 3 legs and you look again at this stool, the CPP, OAS, and GIS, now imagine taking one of the legs, doesn't necessarily collapse completely, but it becomes a lot less stable. That's what we are talking about. So how much money are we talking about? As of July to September 2026, the maximum GIS for a single senior is about $1,123 a month. That's roughly $13,500 a year, and GIS payments are not taxable. So that's the maximum. It doesn't mean every single senior gets $1,123 a month. Your actual amount depends on your income and circumstances. But let's use the maximum simply to understand the scale. Let's try to understand the scale. $13,500 a year is not pocket change, especially when you are building a retirement budget around a modest income. Let's talk about the bigger picture. Imagine someone who qualifies for both OAS and GIS, and if they move abroad and lose GIS, and that's potentially around 13,500, let's say, and if they also don't meet the requirements to continue receiving OAS outside of Canada, the combined loss can be substantially more. That's why I wouldn't make a retirement abroad decision by looking only at one factor. And sometimes people get the math backwards and they say, can rent an apartment there for $1,000 a month instead of $2,000 here. And that's great. That's worth looking at. But then you have to ask, what happens to my income? Not just what happens to my expenses. You get the point, right? You have to consider both sides of the equation. So now we will look at this graphic here. Will moving actually save you money? And this is probably my favorite graphic as part of the conversation because it puts two sides of the equation together. On one side, your retirement income, on the other side, your cost of living. And then there is that big question, will moving actually save money? That's an important question. Not, is Mexico cheaper or is Portugal cheaper? And certainly not, can I rent a condo for less? The real question is, will the overall financial picture be better for me? Because losing a government benefit can change the entire calculation. Don't just look at one factor, the rent. Let's say you can save $800 a month on housing just by moving, That's 9,600 a year. Sounds great, but if your move causes you to lose 13,500 a year in GIS, you're actually worse off by about 3,900 before considering anything else. And that's before we talk about flights, moving expense, insurances, taxes, currency exchange, healthcare, transportation, visiting your family back home, and all of these little expenses that come with living somewhere else is why I think retirement abroad requires a planning that needs to start with the net expense and needs to take into consideration all of these factors. One important fact about GIS is income tested. So while you are living in Canada, the amount you receive depends on your income. The maximum amount isn't guaranteed. It can change depending on your income and your marital status. And GIS is reviewed periodically based on income information. So if you're counting on GIS as part of your retirement budget, you need to understand exactly how much you are actually receiving. Don't simply use the maximum number from a government website. Look at your own situation. This is another question. Can I just come back for 5 months and reset things? And that question naturally comes up. Someone might say, okay, but what if I live abroad for 5 months, come back to Canada for a while, and then leave again? This is where I would be very careful. The issue isn't simply counting flights. Canadian authorities look at residence and can compare information and can share that information with Canada Border Services Agency. So I wouldn't build a retirement strategy around trying to manipulate the calendar. The question is not simply how many days was I physically inside Canada. Your actual residency circumstances matter. If you are genuinely moving abroad and making another country your home, that's very different from spending part of the winter somewhere else and maintaining your life in Canada. And if you are unsure about your situation, this is exactly the point where you should talk to Service Canada or a qualified professional. Don't try to outsmart the rules. Understand them. We might ask, why are the rules different for these benefits? If you think back to CPP, you worked, you contributed, you paid into Canada Pension Plan. So CPP is fundamentally connected to your contribution. And OAS and GIS are different. They are government benefits funded through general government revenues, and their eligibility is tied much more closely to residence, and in the case of GIS, income. So when you understand that distinction, the different rules that make all these different rules, that it makes a little bit more sense. CPP, you contributed. OAS, residency matters. GIS, residency, and income matter. That's a very simple way to remember it. There is another important detail here. The 20-year rule isn't necessarily the end of the story. Canada has social security agreements with a number of countries. These agreements can sometimes allow periods of residence or contributions in another country to help establish eligibility for certain benefits. So, if you have lived in another country during your adult life, don't automatically assume I only have 16 years in Canada, so I can't receive OAS abroad. You may have another route depending on the country and the agreement. But there is an important distinction. An agreement can help you qualify. It doesn't necessarily mean those foreign years are added to your Canadian OAS calculation as though you lived in Canada. The amount of OAS is generally based on Canadian residence. Don't guess. Check your individual situation. And a simple way to think about your own situation is, if you are considering retirement abroad, I would sit down with a piece of paper and write down 4 things. Number 1 is, how many years have I lived in Canada since age 18? Number 2 is, how much CPP am I expecting? Number 3 is, how much OAS am I expecting? And number 4 is, am I receiving GIS? And if so, how much? Then ask, what happens to each one if I become a non-resident? That's your starting point. Don't forget that OAS is not always the same amount. Another thing people sometimes miss is that OAS itself can be partial. If you have lived in Canada for fewer than 40 years, after the age of 18, you may receive a partial OAS pension. The basic calculation is generally based on the number of years of residence divided by 40. So if you take 20 divided by 40, or 50% of a full OAS pension, if you have 30 years, 30 upon 40, or 75%, again, these are simple illustrations, not personal benefit calculations. But it gives you an idea of why your residency history matters. The mistake I would try to avoid, making the decision in this order. I found a beautiful apartment. The weather is amazing. The food is cheaper. Let's move. And only afterward asking, oh, what happened to my government benefits? I reverse that. Start with, what income will I have? And then, what taxes will I pay? Then, what will healthcare cost? And what will housing cost? What will transportation cost? And how much will it cost to visit family? And finally, does the move actually improve my retirement? and do the math before you move. Look at this graphic, that moving, will it actually save me money? The calculator in the graphic says it all. Don't make it an emotional decision only. Make it a spreadsheet decision too. I absolutely love the idea of living somewhere warm. You can dream about sitting on the balcony, overlooking the ocean. You can imagine your morning coffee, somewhere warm, beautiful. I think that's wonderful. But first, do the math, because a beautiful retirement isn't very beautiful if the numbers don't work. What I would do before leaving Canada, and if I was preparing for my retirement abroad, is this. CPP, what I'm actually entitled to. Second, check my OAS. Look at my residency history since age 18. And third, check my GIS if I'm receiving it, and understand what happens if I leave Canada. And fourth, check whether Canada has a social security agreement with the country I'm moving to. That could matter. And fifth, look at the taxes, because moving countries can change your tax situation. Sixth, look at healthcare and insurance. And don't assume your Canadian provincial healthcare will work the way it does at home. And seventh is, build two budgets. One budget for living in Canada and one budget for living abroad. Then compare them and see where it puts you. I don't think this means Canadians shouldn't retire abroad. Not at all. There are some very good reasons to consider it. Maybe you want warmer weather, maybe you want a different lifestyle, maybe you want to travel. But end of the day, you do have to look at that math and, if possible, consult with a professional financial advisor, and then only take those decisions. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please put your comments and subscribe, and let's be on this journey together. Thank you.